Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, E-Mobility, Fire Risk in Social Housing. What does reasonable action look like? So e-bikes and e-scooters, mobility scooters, other lithium-ion powered devices now growing reality across residential buildings. Challenge for housing providers is that while devices may be privately owned, the consequences of an incident can affect escape routes, neighbouring homes, and of course the wider building. So today's session is about one central question: what does reasonable and proportionate action look like? So we're not here to be alarmist or to suggest blanket bans. We recognise the pressures that housing providers are under, legal, financial, operational, and of course equality related. We also want to explore what practical steps organisations can take to reduce risk, from resident education, staff awareness, through to identifying where devices are stored and charged, assessing high risk situations, and introducing proportionate mitigation where needed. We're joined today by Pete Apps, journalist and contributor to Inside Housing, and Nick Coombe from London Fire Brigade. Thank you, Pete, Nick, for agreeing to share your insights with us today. Pete's also gathering insight from the sector for an Inside Housing article on e-mobility fire risk. We're going to start by handing over to Pete. Pete, I don't think you need an introduction. Please fire away.
Thanks, Nigel, and hi everyone. Thanks for coming along. There's great to see so many people on the call, which I think probably reflects the sort of gravity of the issue. I mean, Nigel kindly said I don't need an introduction, but I probably do for someone at least. So I'm a journalist, as Nigel said. I've spent most of my career working at Inside Housing, which hopefully you've all come across at some point in your career. I've obviously written a lot about fire safety, particularly in the 9 years that have followed the Grenfell Tower fire. I would partly say that because, I'm a journalist. My expertise, such that I have any, is in producing magazine articles and news articles and that sort of thing. Is not in the nature of a lithium-ion runaway fire or how to mitigate fire risks in social housing, or all the kind of many trade-offs and different pressures there are on your lives. So I sort of say that just to inject a little bit of humility into my talk at the start, in that I can kind of, as a journalist, I can tell stories and I can talk about big picture trends, and that's what I'm here to do. But perhaps I'm not. There's ways in which I'm probably the least expert person on this call, which always makes me feel a little bit funny about being the one given the microphone and asked to talk about it. But with that said, perhaps it is helpful to kind of have a reminder of the overall picture. And I suppose one of my reflections is how fast the rise in e-bikes has been, and also the rise in e-bikes as a fire risk. I mean, it's not very long ago that. Oh, can we go back? Sorry, on the slide to the first one. Thank you. It's not very long ago that seeing someone sort of riding a scooter around your town that's electric powered was quite a novelty, and now they're completely ubiquitous. Parents use them on the school run. They are the source of a good deal of employment for people who work in the kind of delivery and courier sectors, and we all know how much of that work there is available in the modern economy. So these things have changed society. They've sort of popped up over the last 10 years. No one's really commented on it massively, but they've gone from being a sort of fringe little toy to being a major part of urban transport. And that's brought a lot of benefits, I suppose. They're green compared to using a car for a short journey. They allow people to access employment that they might not have otherwise been able to get. And they're relatively cheap. So they're a form of transport that's available to people who might not have been able to afford a car. And so in a lot of ways, they're a great technology that has brought a lot of good to the world. However, they come with this risk of fire. And it's for a lot of reasons which you guys will be familiar with, a very serious risk. But again, just kind of reflecting on my experience as a journalist reporting on these stories and reporting on this area, I remember this kind of coming up not long ago as a, wow, this is a new unusual thing that has just arrived. A lithium ion battery in someone's house catching fire and causing, well, not a lithium ion battery, but a bike conversion battery catching fire and causing a really serious fire. I wonder what this is going to do and what kind of trend this is going to create. And sort of almost before we finished having that conversation, we're in the midst of it, because that trend of e-bikes and e-bike fires causing really serious challenges to the sort of fire safety and housing world is the world we live in right now. It's not a future world anymore. And that the speed that we've gone from this being a future problem coming over the horizon to being, you know, a fundamental frontline reason why fire safety in the home environment is changing has happened so rapidly that you know, even as a journalist in the media, it's there hasn't been a moment where we've kind of stopped and thought, let's talk about this, let's do the kind of big features and explanations on it. And so for you guys as housing professionals, you've got to put policies in place to manage it and change your procedures and way of thinking to cope. That's an even more extreme position. So yeah, look, that's the thing that's worth reflecting on here, I think, is that this has come along very rapidly. And so it might be the case that people are a bit behind, and that's not necessarily something that people should be blamed for, but now it's time to catch up. So again, you guys probably have these numbers at your fingertips, but the rise in e-bike fires over the last few years has been genuinely alarming. A couple of stats that aren't on my slide, but there was, I think, for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services, they had just 4 instances in 2020-21, rising to 26 in 2023-4, and in the London Fire Brigade, they've risen from a very, very small number in the late 2010s to 143 e-bike fires in 2024 alone. So that's getting on for one every 2 days across the capital in London. And again, that illustrates the point I was making on the first slide, in that this has come around you. So trends like this, and Nick would be able to talk about this more clearly, but going from a position of very few or none to one every 2 days in such a short space of time isn't something that happens an awful lot, especially in the world of fire safety. And what's the particularly serious part of that is that those fires are not just fires which are damaging properties and resulting in increases in insurance claims, although they are doing that, but they're properties which are resulting in deaths and injuries. We've lost 15 people to fatal fires with e-bikes since 2023. There's been 100+ injuries. You know, you can see on the slide there that it's 432 fires in 2025 alone. So, you know, across the country, that's more than one a day. And the reason for that, again, this will be information that's known to everyone on this call, but it is in the nature of what these fires are, because of how rapid and how high temperature they are so quickly, which sort of takes away these layers of protection, as fire engineers call it, that we might have in a block of flats, or a residential home for that matter. You know, a smoke alarm might not be much good for an e-bike, for example, because by the time the smoke alarm's going off, the fire's progressed to such a serious state that it's too late, potentially, particularly depending on where the e-bike's stored. And you know, the heat and the ferocity of the fire and the toxicity of the vapor that's produced when one of these things starts burning means that, you know, even if you get the fire brigade there in the arrival times that they target, and you get water on the fire in the times they target, or even if you have sprinkler protection perhaps, you might not be doing enough to combat one of these fires. And that makes it a very different kind of fire risk from the the types of fires that you guys have dealt with in a residential context before, failures in white goods or chip pans or cigarettes. These are things that, maybe chip pans being an exception, but they start slowly and then grow. And that's exactly the opposite of what an e-bike does. And unlike chip pans, touch wood, most of the time that's going to happen when people are awake and people are sort of moving around and cooking things. This will happen in the middle of the night when everyone's asleep, which cuts their reaction time and cuts their escape time. And so you're talking about a very, very, very serious life-threatening trend. This isn't sometimes in fire safety. What we're really talking about is property protection and insurance. And in this instance, we are very, very, very actively talking about risk to lives. I saw a presentation a couple of weeks ago from people at the housing department on fire safety statistics, and there's this kind of very treasured trend in UK fire safety that we've been reducing the deaths of people's deaths in fires pretty much every year since the 1980s. That obviously that's a stat that can be misused because it can blind us to certain risks. And obviously it wasn't the case in 2017 when the Grenfell Tower fire happened. But broadly speaking, that is a trend to be proud of because, it's a very good thing if fewer people are dying in fires. But that has bottomed out. The fire deaths haven't decreased for a number of years now, and so injuries have started to even start to tick up. And what's happening, or what this person from the housing department said, at least, is what you were seeing is overall incidents coming down, but the number of injuries and fatalities from those incidents rising, so that the overall numbers stay flat. And their assumption and theory related to that is that what that reflects is these really serious, dangerous fires caused by e-bike incidents they've become so prominent now that they are changing the national statistical picture, and taking away some of the progress that's been made in other areas. We're obviously on a call with social landlords now. E-bikes are going to be an issue anywhere, any residential context. And like I said before, they're ubiquitous now. They're things that are used by all sorts of different people, not just a particular group of workers. However, they are clearly something which impacts social housing and social landlords to a greater extent than other tenures of housing. And that's not just me saying that comes from the insurance industry, and they can see the trends in the number of claims they get and the number of payouts they're making, and they can see that the social housing is more directly affected by this than other areas. And it doesn't take a genius to work out why that might be. People on lower incomes are more likely to reach for a cheaper form of transport. People on lower incomes are more likely to work in the gig economy or seek a bit of part-time work on top of the main job they have, a little bit of cash in hand maybe, and e-bikes are going to be useful if that's the part of the economy you function in. And then above and beyond that, if I was to go out and buy an e-bike, I'd probably go and get one. I'd have a look at a few kind of Google reviews and pick out a model that I thought was highly rated and from a nice manufacturer. Whereas if you're on benefits, or you're on a very low paid job, you're going to probably choose the one that's most affordable to you. And unfortunately, that drives people towards the lower end of the market, and means that they go for the cheaper conversions from potentially kind of unregistered or unregulated premises, purchase them secondhand, etc. And that means that they're not only more likely to be users of e-bikes, but they're also going to be using them, using the cheapest ones and the least regulated ones, where the fire risk is going to be highest. And then you've got the obvious nature of what social housing is. Social housing has more high-rise housing than other tenures, and if you're talking about a type of fire, which this is, which gives you a very limited window of time to escape, before it becomes a life-threatening or injury-threatening incident. If you're on the 15th floor of a high-rise building, you have much less chance to get out. You know, if you're in a house, a ground floor house, you probably at any one time got 5 potential exits, so long as you can scramble out of a window. If you're in a high-rise building, you've got one exit, and it's your flat entrance door. And if the e-bike has caught fire in that space, then you are not going to get out of that building. You need to be rescued, and the speed with which e-bike fires develop mean that's going to be really tough. You know, people will be aware that you know, there have been a number of incidents in high-rise buildings where e-bikes have caught fire and tenants have died. Tenants have died falling from buildings because they've tried to escape out of the windows and so on. And that is a problem which is bigger for you guys than it is for other housing tenures, because you manage more high-rise housing. Secondly, there's a crossover with overcrowding, because, you know, as soon as you introduce overcrowding, you're compounding the risk of injury, because there's more people there. There's a very, very serious incident which I talked about. It was private rented housing, but it was a former right to buy flat. So there's a social landlord as the overall property owner. And I think that an e-bike caught fire in a bedroom of a flat where there were more than 20 people in a 2-bedroom property. And in the end, one gentleman very sadly died. But you think of an incident like that happening again, and you could very easily see how it would be many more people being unable to escape. So it's a big problem for social housing. It's a problem that is a life safety risk to residents, not just those who have e-bikes, but those who live in neighbouring properties as well. And therefore, it's something that the social housing sector as a whole needs to have a strategy for dealing with. So, you know, what can be done and what is being done in the sector. I think one of the things that I remember about this is, I think one of the first incidents of an e-bike fire death that sort of at least made the news was in Hammersmith and Fulham in West London. And after that, Hammersmith and Fulham made an attempt, or at least they had a discussion about banning e-bikes in blocks of flats, which might seem like an attractive policy given the scale of the risk, as we've talked about. However, I don't think that's workable, and I don't actually think it's desirable either, because if you think about what I said at the start of the meeting about the way this is a kind of key route to employment for people, I think you've got to think very carefully about taking that away. And secondly, you've got to think realistically about what a landlord can enforce. You know, how realistic in a block of more than 100 homes, some of which will have people coming and going, you know, relatives, etc. Is it going to be to enforce a ban on e-bikes? You know, and can you even do that under the rules of someone's tenancy? So, you know, I don't think we can turn back the clock on this. I don't think we can just get e-bikes out of social housing. And even if we could, perhaps there would be an argument that wouldn't be a desirable thing to do. So the question then becomes, how do we manage the risks that these devices pose? And then there's a couple of things that people are doing, some of which people on the call probably are doing. Gen 2, for example, in Sunderland in the northeast, has it's got 25 high-rise towers, and then 10 of those which are built with a sort of large panel system, designed, people will be aware of, sort of very vulnerable to collapse and fire spread and so on, compared to other types of building. And so what they've done is they've had a focused program within those 10 buildings, where they've worked with the fire and rescue service and a local trusted e-bike manufacturer to go through that building flat by flat and say, do you have an e-bike? Do you have an e-scooter? You know, you can have a free health check, a free bit of maintenance on it. You know, what can we do to make sure this device is as safe as it can be? And I think through doing that, they did find at least a couple where there were potential issues with the battery, and they sort of got it fixed for the tenant. it costs a small amount of money in the context of a housing provider's budget and saves an awful lot in terms of the costs of dealing with a fire, let alone the kind of the human costs of deaths and injuries. And then there's a question about identifying residents in buildings that are at particular risk. Obviously, I've mentioned overcrowding. There's a question of disability here and the new responsibilities that sit with social housing providers around residential peeps. Certainly in high-rise buildings, I've talked about e-bikes mostly in this presentation, but an e-mobility device, an like a electronic device to help with mobility is going to be linked to disability, which is then going to be linked to issues with ease of escape from a flat. So, the people who are most likely to die, I guess, of these fires are people who are going to struggle to escape. That's always the case. And so perhaps if you can only do some interventions targeting it into those places is a way to start prioritizing your resources. Similarly, we have good data because of all the other stuff that's going on in the fire safety world about the buildings that are most at risk. The worst case scenario we have is an e-bike fire in a building where dangerous cladding also exists and hasn't been remediated yet, because this will break out of the window very, very fast and it will impact the facade. So in those buildings, something needs to be done about e-bikes first. So, everyone in the social housing sector knows about the limits on resources, but there are ways to go with what you've got to the places where it will have the highest impact first. And then there are things being done as again, as people will know, about educating staff and educating residents about the risks. I make myself quite unpopular when I go around to friends' houses if they have e-scooters or e-bikes, because as soon as I see it next to the front door, I start rattling on about thermal runaway and that sort of thing, and then they tend to sort of look quite confused and bored, but maybe plug their thing into charger somewhere else in the flat, or don't charge it at night and that sort of thing. And that information is, you forget when you're in a fire safety space that it would be a massive surprise to most people that there's a fire risk associated with this stuff at all. They're just plugging it in the same way as they plug in their laptop and their phone and all the other hundreds of devices we use, and not thinking for a second that this is a device which could potentially kill them. So all of this information, once people know it, they'll change their behavior if they can. And then there's red flags for housing managers or contractors or anyone else who's going into people's flats. Is the battery being charged in a cluttered area? Is it being charged on an extension lead with multiple plugs in it? Is it blocking an escape route? Are there signs of physical damage to the bike and particularly the battery? Or have you noticed that it's charging overnight? Potentially, it might be a difficult thing for a housing manager to spot, but all of those things might be a trigger to a housing manager, to a contractor, to someone going in to say, "Oh, I've noticed your e-bike's a bit busted up. Here's a leaflet about the risks. Maybe take it down to the local shop and have it looked at. That can be a serious fire risk." Gentle stuff like that, but it can make a big difference. And then, of course, there's providing safe outside storage. I'm sure Nigel will talk about that, and there's obviously questions around space, around buildings, and the cost of doing it, and the trust residents have in how safe that storage is, and all kinds of challenges that are mixed in with that. However, if a bike catches fire in a shed outside a building, it doesn't kill anyone. So those are different interventions. I think there's a need here for probably sector-wide guidance and best practice and all of that sort of stuff. And as Nigel mentioned, we've written about this before in Inside Housing, of course, and I'll be covering it again in the next couple of months and trying to pull some of that out. But I think at this point, if you're not doing any of these things, then, or something else that works for you, then a strategy needs to be put in place. So I think I've overrun slightly on time, but I'll leave it there and hand back to Nigel.
Thank you. I got a couple of questions for you. I've heard you speak before about the danger of hoping for the best. In this context of e-mobility and your experience from looking at previous incidents, what would you expect to be scrutinized after a serious incident?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. And I think, if you look back to the questions that were asked of the kind of housing managers after at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, for example, It was, they were put under pressure to say, well, why weren't you aware of these things? You were, this was in the media, this was in the, this was talked about in the industry, what is your excuse for not having known that this was an issue? And it was very difficult for those people to answer those questions. I think there's one email that sort of really jumps out at me from the inquiry, and I think spoke to sort of a broader attitude, which was, there was some serious problems with the smoke ventilation system inside Grenfell Tower, and that was something that the housing provider had been aware of for quite a long time before the fire broke out. But there were, as is sometimes the case, pretty serious delays getting it sorted out. So I think that the head of health and safety had been told that it was going to be another year before anything was done about the smoke ventilation system, and that was. It was a problem to the extent that the building shouldn't have had a stay put policy according to the assessments they'd done, because it was beyond economic repair and non-functioning. And her response to hearing that it was going to be out for another year was, quote unquote, "Let us hope our luck holds and there isn't a fire." And I think that email kind of expressed something, I think, about the approach to housing management and risk management, which was, fingers crossed, we know it's not safe, but there hasn't been a fire yet, and maybe there won't be one next week as well, so we'll still be fine. And it's a very, very dangerous attitude, because eventually your luck will run out, and it's not the way to plan for risk, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think a lot of things have changed since then, but there's a lot of pressures, aren't there, on the sector, which still present a challenge. Do you think, as a sector, we could still be focused on sort of the legal boundaries and legal requirements, and not enough on foreseeable harm?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a risk of that, isn't there? I mean, there's so many things that social housing providers have to comply with, and there isn't in this area particularly, unless I've missed something, which I might have done. I don't think there is, beyond the broader impact this has on kind of fire safety order responsibilities. A lot of this stuff happens inside the residence flat, which is not part of the common parts, and typically sort of seen as outside the kind of general fire safety responsibilities that people have. But the thing is, this is killing people in a way that a lot of the other fire risks we talk about aren't. Not to this scale. The deaths in social housing, the sort of fire safety deaths in social housing, are being driven more by e-bikes than anything else, as far as I can tell at the moment. And so that does beg the question of, well, yes, it's not necessarily the latest piece of legislation and the latest piece of compliance, and it's not something the regulator's necessarily going to ask you questions about. But in terms of achieving what we're all here for, which is safer homes and fewer lives lost in fires, then it should be a very high priority. I mean, it is that difference which is often talked about in fire safety, between asking a question of what's safe and what's necessary, and what am I required to do for compliance, and those two things are often not quite the same.
Yeah. No, thank you, Pete. That's fantastic. And so, looking to move across to Nick. Nick, please introduce yourself and share your insights from London Fire Brigade, if you would.
Yeah, thanks. Morning, everyone. My name's Nick Bloom. I am Head of Service Improvement in London Fire Brigade's Prevention and Protection Department. And this topic that we are speaking about is very much both protection and prevention. There are dual roles we have around how we protect residents and people, and also obviously we have our enforcement arm of the fire safety order, where it's more around ensuring the building is fit for purpose as well. So I'm sure you've all seen some graphic fires on the telly, etc. There is a YouTube link there, and the slides are can be shared. I was trying to embed a video in the, but it failed me, unfortunately. So I put the link in there. But I think what's been mentioned before, the key difference in these kind of fires are the speed of how quickly they go from just a little bit of warmth, a little bit of smoke to full ceiling to floor flames, which is obviously the thermal runaway. So and it's them bits that really make the fire go so quick that our normal assumptions around how long people have got to get out of a building are basically invalid in these types of fires. In a normal fire, the fire will start, smoke will spread, it will reach the smoke detector, hopefully giving you enough time to get out of the building. But these fires spread so quickly that your means of escape can actually be null and void before even sometimes the smoke detector's gone off. So it's a real serious problem. And I think some of the things Peter covered, I might duplicate slightly, and I apologise for that. But I think hearing the message twice isn't such a bad thing. They're here to stay, and I've kind of done more around lithium-ion batteries rather than just the e-bike scooters and devices, because we've got them in virtually everything in our day life, our mobile phones, our laptops, our phone charger banks, vapes, which are causing horrendous fires in amenity tips and things like that, because people are not disposing of them properly. We're having lots of fires in them kind of situations. People are taking them into work, so it's not just housing. I actually attended Marsham Street, which is the home of MHCLG in the Home Office, and there I saw an e-scooter being charged under a desk there, which I thought was, inappropriate in that workplace as such. So that they are everywhere, and we're not going to stop them. So total bans are not the answer. It's about practical solutions, about education around how we can solve that problem. So here are the stats from LFB, and as you can see, they are on that fundamental quick rise. And again, I'll have to talk about these are the ones we know around, and I'll talk a bit about sometimes why it's difficult to know whether the fire was caused by the battery or whether it just became involved in it, because that's another point. If you've got these in your properties, even if they don't cause the fire, if they become involved in the fire, then the same effect of thermal runaway will happen eventually. So there are risks whether they're the cause or whether they're a bit of the fire loading. So we have to look at it from that point of view. You'll see e-bikes, unsurprisingly, are the big one. Sometimes because some of them are outside, so it's really easy to do. And I'll talk a little bit about inside. We've got e-cigarettes, we've got other lithium batteries that you see quite a bit, e-scooters. You may have seen in the news that you're now going to be allowed to put solar panels on your balcony. You're going to be able to buy them in the middle aisle of Lidl's. Well, they are batteries as well, as such. You've even got houses now that are going to run on batteries, and it's so as soon as you invent something like that, you'll get to people with the DIY kits, the cheaper versions, the versions from overseas that don't go through our strict regime that we've got in this country. And these are the things that you can't stop. You can't stop innovation. We don't want to stop innovation, but sometimes there are unintended consequences around this, and no one does things to harm themselves in these situations. Sometimes it's out of a case of need. Some of these bikes are very expensive, and even when I've spoken to housing providers who say, look, I'm willing to provide a metal container for put them in, but that just draws attention that these expensive items are in there, because we've got to deal with security. Most people that I speak to, when we've done some of our e-bikes with the Uber Eats and things like that, is they're more worried about the bike being stolen than catching fire, because it is their livelihood. They're not on great money, and so protecting their asset is the most important thing. Even when I say to them, your family and your life is your asset, but they will still have it in their bedroom if they live in a one-room flat, and it's limited access for them to where they store it. And it also draws other issues around this. Peter in Inside Housing did a little bit on dark kitchens. If you don't know what dark kitchens are, obviously Uber Eats and all the other companies now do this. It is really big business, and a lot of them started from actual restaurants, takeaways, etc., where you get your stuff delivered from. Now it's become such a big business, we're now finding industrial size kitchens in estates where they are basically a 24/7 service of making food and delivering it. And what you find there is 20, 30, 40 riders are there all day, either resting or in some cases in the middle of the night sleeping. So therefore you've got a different kind of risk from us, from the fire brigade. So we get a call to factory light, thinking, okay, it's a factory light, 2 o'clock in the morning, probably no one in there. And then we're faced with people sleeping, living, working in there, and 40 e-bikes that are now involved in the fire, even if they didn't cause it in the first place. And we're starting to see them in homes as well, where people have used it. We are going through a fuel crisis, a cost of living crisis, and when these things happen, this is where people get more inventive to try and save money, and and do that, and do things that they might not do, and buy things that are cheaper, etc. This is a picture from an actual fire site, and it's what I spoke about before. Is it the cause that are involved? What you can see in the picture is them little things that look like bullets. They are the remnants of a large battery, and you'll see there's some tools around it, and there's a little bit of an e-bike that you can see. You can just see the shaft where the handlebars go in. So you can imagine from a fire investigation point of view, when we get to a scene and which the fire's put out, of trying to determine whether it was the cause or whether it just got involved in the fire. But the result is the same: significant damage to a flat. And even when we're turning up in London's very lucky with its attendance times and how quick we can get weight of attack, but we are seeing significant increases in fire damage in people's homes. And again, not all down to lithium-ion batteries, but just what we now have in our flats. If you think around, most of our building construction things are based on post-war building studies, where they looked at what people had in their houses and they developed in a fire, and they said they produced 2.5 kilowatts of a fire, and that's kind of stood the test of time. But we are seeing significant. Back then, you were lucky if there was a telly in the living room. Now there are tellies in every bedroom that are slimline, that are basically cans of petrol on your wall from a fire point of view, and they are causing it's very rare we find fires now that are confined to room of origin. Hopefully they're confined to flat of origin. If the front door is okay. You may have seen a fire only last week in Camden where there was 7 people taken to hospital. The front door of the flat wasn't correctly fitting. Significant fire, and the smoke that came out of that one flat was so significant that even when the crews got there and opened the door of the staircase, which they have to fight the fire, it filled the staircase up pretty quickly. So this is all to do with the fire loading that you've got in these flats. So we try and work out. So sometimes in our fires, it's not always we're always getting the right data, because again, as I said from the scene there, that it's really difficult sometimes to be able to determine whether it was the cause or whether it was it was just involved from a fire starting somewhere else. Okay, next slide, please. So we've tried to connect data on the type of make and model, and you can see from the, they're very small numbers, mainly because by the time we get there, it's so significant damage. It's not as easy to tell what it is, and that's why you'll see there are 528 where we couldn't really tell from that. So don't take it from the fact that Apple and some of the others have got low numbers. It might mean that we just couldn't identify them when we got there. This is what we try and identify regular brands, because those who've followed us with our white goods program we've had some great success around. If we can identify the brand, and it's we can then go to OPSS, get warnings out, get recalls out, and we would do exactly the same if we found an e-bike or any lithium-ion battery problem. We'd send that to the manufacturers and get that information out there. We also look around the boroughs, and again, I'm not sure this tells you a lot, because of the fact that obviously the more highly dense boroughs, you're going to get more of the fires in that borough. It's common sense, and especially around them areas where you've got more of the e-bike, the gig economy, nighttime food deliveries. This is again only probably an issue in more of our bigger towns and cities. The rural areas don't tend to get this kind of stuff because of the fact that they're a long way away to get an Uber Eats as such. So it is going to be more in the condensed areas as such, from that point of view. I think the better we get, the better our data gets. Is how we're going to do it. I'm sure we've had more fires. I looked at the poll that you put about people didn't know whether they had a fire that involved an e-bike, and that's probably the reason why it is. So we are trying to improve how we get data, so we can do it. And London is the best source from the UK Fire and Rescue Service, because we will get more than any other fire and rescue service, from that point of view. So we are getting very, very better at recording it. We have a special recording on our things, so we know whether it's an e-bike or that. So I think you'll see them figures go up more and more as we get better at collecting the data, as well as more and more of these being used in our society today. So what are the main causes? So poor charging, overloading of sockets, typical stuff we find just in ordinary day-to-day stuff, but also around the types of chargers people buy. The cost of an Apple for an iPhone charger, when you can look on Amazon and find one for $2.99 that seems to meet the requirements. And again, it goes back to what Pete was saying around social landlords, etc. will get this, and where people are struggling to survive in this current cost of living crisis, that they're all cutting corners, and so you will see more and more of this, more overloading of sockets, which can cause it. What we find with the e-bike trade is the DIY kits. That means where you've converted an ordinary bike, so what was pedal power, for want of a better word, you can buy kits legally on site. You can do them yourself, and you now convert your bike into an electric bike. It's cheaper because some of the really, really good e-bikes are very, very expensive. So you've got a bike already. Why don't I just put a massive battery on it, and then it'll make me get faster up hills, etc. But these are the ones that we are finding where they've either been installed incorrectly, or actually they're not very good quality, because they've come from not this country, and therefore they're not that great, and they are the real ones. And also around damage, I'm sure you've all seen the way some of the riders ride their bikes when they're delivering the food. It's all about volume, quick, get there quick, and they, you know, they don't look after their bikes as that such, and so things get damaged. They drop them, they get knocked off, you know, of their bikes, and they pick it up, they carry on riding, and all that damaged internal bit of the battery will eventually cause for, you know, heat release, and then eventually what it is. So for me, it's around buying the appropriate charging, getting it from a reputable buyer. You know, you get what you pay for, unfortunately, and looking after it, you know, from that point of view. If it is damaged, get it checked. You know, don't, like, if you wear a crash helmet on a bike, if you have a crash, you know, you're meant to replace that helmet. You're not meant to use it again because it's had a damage. For me, if you've had an accident on your e-bike and it's had a crash, go and get it checked out, because it's not obviously, if you've got a visible damage, you'll do something, but sometimes you can damage the internal components of that battery and you won't be able to see it until tragically it'll be too late. So really good advice. So what are the solutions? As you said, total ban is not the answer. However, I do believe that you can give, as housing providers, you can give generic blanket advice around charging, etc., etc. But I think as part of your risk assessment, you will attend properties that you are responsible for where actually you cannot charge in the common areas at all, you know, from that point of view. So you need to do something about that. And that's around signage, around not there, removing the sockets if you need to be, because as Peter said, we know about this problem now, and you do not want to be in front of a coroner explaining why you didn't take reasonable steps. Because if you know that it's a very small bit and that will completely block that means of escape, why have you got sockets there that can be used for this kind of stuff? Because people will do what people do, unfortunately, and someone has to take that higher ground, you know. From that point of view, can you provide some kind of safer storage from that point of view? As I said before, spoken to people who say it's really nice having it stored outside, but someone will crock the padlock and that'll be my bike gone. So we have to be a bit more pragmatic than that. It is their way we can store it. But for me, the key bit is around education, educating your tenants around why it's dangerous, how to do it, because they're going to do it. We know they're going to do it, but do it in a safe way if they have to. You know, the example Peter gave about the collaboration around the fire and rescue service and the fire and rescue service talking to tenants is the real thing, because again, you'll learn so much. And I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs, because I know you know your tenants, but tenants do the most extraordinary things sometimes that you would never think they would do. So this is again really about tenant engagement, around finding what they're doing, finding why they need to do it, and then coming up with a solution. You may have to say no. You may have to, I get that. And then if they do it after that, then you can't control everything people do, as I said. But, you know, giving leaflets around about maintenance, you know, there are offers out there where people are, you know, where police do the marking of the bikes. There are people offering kind of like looking at your bike for servicing kind of thing, you know, kind of thing, offering that and having them management controls around what you need, you know, from that point of view. I think moving forward, though, this very much does remind me a lot of the Grenfell issue. We've got legacy issues that we've got to deal with. Okay, old building stock where they were never designed or built for this. But I do think moving forward, knowing that this is coming or is here, and it's only going to get bigger, especially with government agendas around the green agenda, etc., we need to design buildings in the future better for this kind of stuff. You know, we are going to eventually get 2 staircases in flats, evacuation lifts, etc. But no one's looking at this kind of stuff as well around how do you get this in there? You know, should you do more around the old circuit breakers, etc., etc. Modern day electrics, are better than they were in the older buildings. So I just think we're very slow to react to modern technology coming forward, which is fine. Innovation is innovation, but we know about this now, yet where is it in like ADB or anything like that about how we do that? But, from that point of view, how do we risk assess against it? How do we design it out? Because that's what you should be doing. You should be designing problems out, not waiting for them to happen and trying to do retrofits, which are always very difficult. And the bottom line is, as Peter really put well, is in this economy, the gig economy, this is their livelihood and they need that bike and they will keep it close to them, because without it, it means a lot of difference. And we're not going to change that. We're not going to change that mentality. All we can do is educate better, educate in different languages as well. We know the multi-diversity that we have. Look on your fire brigade websites, we've got stuff on there. We're doing a big campaign in LFB, partnering with Uber and stuff like that. Our charge safe regime. Other fire and rescue services are doing good stuff as well. Just because you live in London, sometimes other fire and rescue services have better stuff on their website. Talk to other housing providers. What are they doing? Collaboration with your tenants is the real key bit around this. Okay, next slide, please. That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nigel.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I think you've covered most of the questions I had, which is really excellent. Thank you. The things around the most common causes, the conversion kits, the damaged and the modified. I don't know if you mentioned that, but a lot of these devices are getting modified, aren't they, to make them go faster and further. And the importance of location, where they're being charged within the property. As an interesting comment come up in the chat about testing. I think you said about getting it checked, and there's probably no specific standards to sort of check against, but a lot of this is just good practice, isn't it? Some of the biggest risks, like conversion kits, modified devices, damaged, you just see these things, don't you, with batteries, gaffer tapes to the frame of the bike, with wires all over the place. Do you think it's important that we don't sort of overcomplicate the issue? Because a lot of the biggest risks could actually be identified from a simple inspection if we were actually looking out for them, people knew what to look for. What are your thoughts around that, Nick?
I think, there will be obvious things you can see. As you said, sometimes you see the battery gaffer taped onto the bike and all that kind of thing. I do think, what fire and rescue services is doing around, there are plenty of videos on YouTube and that around how to convert your bike. Some are unsafe, they should be taken down quickly, so there's more of a publicity and a kind of government kind of lobbying around this, because they are, people are dying. It's a fact, and from that point of view. So I think we as a fire and rescue service need to do more from that. And obviously, if you're inspecting your properties and you see bikes that are like that, you need, as I said, education is the only way. And I'll be the first to admit, you can't educate everyone. It's impossible. As I said, people will do what people will do. But I think as a landlord, responsible person, you have to be able to say to yourself, have I done enough, to reduce that risk? You can't, you're not going to reduce it to zero. You're not going to stop it. Even if you did a total ban, you only have to look at it's we're now talking about e-bikes. Years ago, it was pot plants and carpet in blocks of flats. They were the issue. We had zero tolerance policies and we had management policies, and it's very similar to that. You're not going to stop it. So therefore, what can you do? If something happens in one of your blocks, have you got the evidence, the policies, the documentations to say this is what we did about this issue? It unfortunately happened, but we couldn't have really done any more reasonably, you know. And this is what I say, I see a lot of blanket information, but I do think there is a individual bit around each building that you go to when you're doing your review of your fire risk assessment, or anything that you go in there around. Is there specific things to that particular building that I need to add that little bit more? Or, as I said, that may be a total ban. And I think although they probably won't do that, you have to have evidence and an audit trail that you try to enforce that. You know, from that point of view, you can't turn a blind eye when you go there and see stuff being charged, you know, say, well, actually, they'll do it anyway. What are your processes? How are you protecting yourself? It's very much about that. This is also around, you know, the priority of this is around obviously stopping people being injured from these, but it's also around your own protection, around have you done enough, you know. Having, like Peter, full of every day of the inquiry, you know, you can see how people left themselves open. You know, there was no audit trail, there was no records, or there was emails about stuff that they knew. And you all know this, and this is the bit. Once you know something, you can't unknow it.
Mm. Yeah, really key points there, Nick. Thank you. So let's get started on our panel discussion. So I've just got a few questions around what I think is quite important framework that we educate, but we also actively look to identify where those risks might be in our buildings, and we do sort of more detailed assessments, and then look to mitigate that as much as possible. So the first one is around education. What messaging do we think, you know, is the most effective for residents and staff? And how do we avoid that becoming just another leaflet or poster that nobody reads? What do you think about that, Pete?
It's a good question. I think, you know, I think we all know that lots of people don't read their post. You know, like that's just a fact of life, whether you're a social housing tenant or not. We all get a lot of stuff through the I think Nick used the phrase a previous conference we were at, the useful filing system known as the bin. And the thing is, I think it needs clear communication. I don't necessarily want to say alarmism, but you know, I think once you've seen an image of an e-bike fire, you're not going to forget it in a hurry. And you know, a letter which sort of is printed on the same letter-headed paper that the housing association uses for, you know, telling you your service charges are going up, or there's going to be a summer fete next week, or whatever it is. Over time, people's attention spans are short. There's lots of things going on. They'll ignore it. A leaflet that comes through the letterbox with a picture of an e-bike on fire and something which says, do you know the risks? You know, something that's dramatic, not necessarily sensationalist or alarmist, but dramatic, that grabs people's attention is you know, what's required in this instance. And also I do wonder as well, you know, like, you know, some people have a lot of trust and faith in their housing provider. Some people don't. Some people will read the letters from their housing provider. Some people won't. Could it be a letter from the fire brigade instead? You know, like if I got a letter that's on letterheaded paper from the London Fire Brigade or has a London Fire Brigade logo on it, you're going to feel slightly differently about the content of that to if it's got your housing provider's name on it, and you know, it's just another thing that's being communicated to you from that. And what options do you have with your local fire and rescue service to work on something like that together? So I think there's kind of practical steps, but I think always with this, it's the case of putting yourself in the shoes of a tenant or a resident who's getting lots of letters through the post, are reading some and not reading others, and thinking, okay, well, if I was I am in their shoes, because I get loads of letters from my internet service provider or my bank or whatever, and what is it that makes me actually pick this one up and look at it and read it and understand that it's relevant? And once you've answered that question, you've probably got a solution that works.
Yeah, some great points there, and I'm sure Nick would agree with this, but I've had you know, fire and rescue staff from all over the country actually saying that we'd welcome the opportunity of actually working with a landlord and actually going to, you know, to high risk buildings and so forth and doing that. Nick, you're charge safe. campaign, I think, is really powerful, and I'm sure you're more than happy for landlords all over the country to sort of utilise that. But have you got any further thoughts on how we can, get that message home, as it were?
I think Pete covered most of the salient points around letters through, are not read, but I think again, it's got to be visual in that sense. You look at how they market on packet cigarettes, don't stop people smoking, but then pictures don't look great, do they? And I think, and also make it local. If there has been an e-bike fire in one of your portfolio, tell people that. If because we see a lot of things. We are, people go, it'll never happen to me, but if it did happen in the block next door, or it did happen in the street next door, that is a bit more of a powerful image. From that point of view, it's not a fire that happened in Sunderland if you live in Westminster. So try and make it relevant from that point of view and to them actually, and I think that will make it a lot clearer.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And the last thing, it's got to be regular. It can't just be once and that's it, I've done my job. You need to keep things up going, like the RP stuff. You've got to keep sending the messages out there, keep doing it. And I fully appreciate there is so much for housing to do now. There are so many different pieces of legislation, and this is just one small bit of it. I do appreciate it's not just fire, it's one of the things you have to bother with.
Yeah, no, great points. I know a couple of people that should ask questions, and there's lots of great points coming in the chat, so please keep them coming. I just wanted to cover these a couple of other points. Pete, I think you mentioned Gen 2 and what they're doing to actively go out and talk to people that they know have devices, or they may have them because they've ordered down as vulnerable residents. And do you think that's something which landlords should be doing more, taking a more proactive approach?
Yeah, I think it certainly seems to have worked for Gen 2, and it is it's narrowly targeted because they've got that sort of unusually high number of large panel systems buildings in their stock. So they're looking at they're making a strategy for what do we need to do to prevent a disaster in one of these 10 buildings. And so that that's not, if you've got 100,000 homes, you may not, with the best will in the world, be able to do that for every single home. But if you've got some reason in your building, in your stock portfolio already, to think this building is at a major risk, if a major fire happens here, it's a very, very serious incident quite quickly, then a targeted solution there would be useful. And I think the thing about Gen 2's approach, which I think is also good, and one worth thinking about, is that it's offering a benefit to the tenant. Like, as we've said a few times in the webinar, this is a potentially critical device for someone's livelihood, and so getting it fixed and getting it maintained is good. If you've got an e-bike that you rely on for work, and you can say, look, we're going to do a free maintenance check on it, make sure it runs properly, and make sure it's not going to break down. And I think that attitude again kind of then comes into some of the questions around sort of outside storage and so on. What incentives could you offer if you're storing? You feel like you're increasing the risk of theft a bit, whether you are or you aren't. It feels more vulnerable when it's out there in the outside storage. But are there benefits you can offer in terms of cheaper charging, in terms of like maintenance checks, in terms of et cetera, that go, okay, well, I'm taking an additional risk, but I'm getting a benefit as well. And so I think it's quite a good part of Gen 2's approach in that respect, is that, there's a good reason for people to buy into it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Michael, been waiting there patiently.
Hello. Yeah, I just thought, listening to Peter's amazing summary, the risk seems to be so extremely high that, and the law seems to be far behind this, and it strikes me that shouldn't these have to be registered, like you would have to register a moped or something, and therefore get it, and should they have to be checked once a year? I mean, surely would take 90% of the issues from the housing providers in terms of the quality of them. And the second point is, I'm an occupational therapist, and there's another stream of need with regard to disability mobility scooters, which is a different thing, which is also not sufficiently supported or regulated, and about where they're stored near buildings, like multi-occupancy buildings, etc. And the wheelchair department, the NHS wheelchair department, is like so many decades behind. It's very limited on it, how it supports people in a way with electric wheelchairs and stuff. So there's a whole area of disability need as well, which Peter, you could probably do something on in your work as well.
Great points.
So they should be registered and checked annually. That's my view from the very high risk you've outlined.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think you touched on the legislative side of things being sort of way behind. I don't think we can wait for that. I think as landlords we can insist that devices are registered and regularly checked and serviced. What are your thoughts on that, Pete?
I think on the one hand, I agree with you if we're talking about what policies does the UK need to introduce to deal with this risk. If it's the fire minister, then, or the transport secretary, then I think the most effective regulation will go into the shops that are converting these things badly and the products that are coming onto the market, and that would solve many more problems than the people on this call can do. I think that the two issues then that follow from that is, one, regulation does move slower than fire risk, and that's always the case because the risk emerges and then regulators realize it, and then they spend 2 or 3 years designing a regulatory response and then they implement it, and the fire risk was going to still be there in the time that that's happening. I definitely think it should happen, but you're going to have to deal with the risk before that has come along, and also probably when it does come along and doesn't work for some reason, because that's often the way of these things too. And secondly, I do think that there is a thing of, this won't be the case with everyone, and you sort of want to be a little bit careful about kind of stigmatizing people or whatever, but the fact is there is a degree of kind of like gig economy, dark economy type work which is connected to these devices. And I think even if there was a requirement to register these things and get them checked every year, that's never going to be foolproof, because it's going to involve, when it's a question between someone goes and pays 50 quid for a bike check, or gets on with their job and makes another 200 quid out of a week delivering pizzas, it's going to be very tough to enforce and very tough to get people to buy into. And so I think I would love to see a scheme like that. I think it'd be a really good idea for government to look into. It's not going to come along for a little while with the best will in the world, and even when it does, you're still going to be dealing with this risk to an extent.
Yeah, that's helpful, Pete. And of course, as Mike also mentioned, vulnerable residents needing assistance for disability, we need to look at those things very closely, don't we? Looking on a case-by-case basis, what's the need, what risk is being presented. If it's a powered wheelchair that was supplied under very strict regulations and has been regularly serviced, the risk is low, isn't it? Whereas in another property, we may have an e-bike that's obviously modified and is obviously high risk. So we need to look at those very sensitively, I think. Would you agree on that, Nick?
Yeah, I think the mobility scooter is a kind of good comparison, because there are significant numbers of them now in society, and we're not getting the types of incidents with them, probably because of the kind of people that are using them. From that point of view, how they are charged, and there are not kind of there isn't something that turns your armchair into a mobility scooter, trapping a battery on it, kind of thing. So that it is, it's a case where, I go back to the type of people that own these devices, what they're doing with them, and why it's more important to them from that point of view, where, like Pete said, the registration scheme is a good idea. I think it's probably enforceable, and no government, even bad ones, like to introduce legislation that's unenforceable, from that point of view. And again, it will drive things underground, which is already happening. So So for me, it's about, to stop them products coming over, greater checks on that. OPSS have to do their work a bit better as they get more and more involved in this market. But there isn't a silver bullet on this. That's the thing, like any of this stuff. And we'll get there eventually where it become, where if they get more and more, prices of good things will go down. At the moment, because they are not as mass produced as certain things, that's why people are looking for these conversion kits, because it is cheaper, etc., and maybe we'll get it that way eventually, from that point of view.
Yes, good. Thank you, Nick. So my third point around, assessing what actually risk is being presented, I think we've covered quite a bit of that. Things that are obviously modified or damaged, areas where there's overcrowding and that sort of thing. I think this cuts both ways. As I say, we may actually find that some risks are actually lower than we thought if we look at it carefully, because maybe this mobility scooter doesn't actually have a lithium-ion battery. It still has a lead-acid battery, and it's being regularly serviced, and it's being stored and charged in a safe space. So I think in that detailed level of assessment is important. On the subject of mitigation of risks, there's all sorts of emerging things, and I've got a poll question on this in a minute, ranging from posters, leaflets, things that we can put on electronic notice boards, which are perhaps more impactful, starting to implement device checks, but also things possibly like monitoring the temperature of a battery, or even whether which could give early warning of something starting to come under stress, as well as looking at creating safe charging spaces, be that within the building, which of course is difficult, and externally, which is also difficult. Pete, you got any more views around that sort of mitigation and what you've heard to be effective?
I think, to be honest, it might be in terms of what's effective and what's being done. I mean, I have some sort of, some of the things I mentioned in my presentation, I think are certainly being done. How effective they are, I think, one, I don't know, because I'm not, as I said at the start, my expertise is pulling together news articles, and I don't have the kind of day-to-day housing management experience to really know definitively this is working, this isn't working. And also, I think because it's probably a bit too early, because some of these things came in only quite recently, I would imagine, and there's a bit of time that you need to elapse before you figure out actually, the offering some free maintenance is really good, and that's really cut out a number of incidents. And wow, we went from 200 incidents a year to 20 because we had a massive campaign of public awareness and leafleting in partnership with the Fire Brigade. And that's sort of why I think it's because it is this slightly nascent stage, and I can see some of the comments in the chat about people are trying to work out their strategies at the moment and that sort of thing. I think the sector's really got a job to do in terms of sharing experience. And if you introduce a strategy in your stock and find that you see a dramatic decrease in the number of incidents, then tell everyone in the sector about that, because they'll want to do it as well. So yeah, I mean, I can't sort of, I mean, you can sort of logically see why sort of awareness campaigns, various other things would work. I think I do maybe just want to say, because I can see the comments coming in the chat, that I do think the approach of banning devices is not going to get the sector where it needs to be. And I think that there's also going to be serious problems trying to get that, to achieve that. You'll probably also, and I'm again sort of saying my disclaimer about not being a fire expert. I'm also not a lawyer, so I can't say this definitively, but it did come up previously that what a landlord can and can't ban isn't just a free decision that you can make with a stroke of a pen. It depends on what's written in the tenancy agreement and what powers you do and don't have, and whether the legal right to ban this even exists for social landlords, especially inside people's flats, is questionable. So I think that yeah, the tempting solution of we could just press a button and get rid of all of these devices from blocks of flats is not one that's not really engaging with the real world issue that we're facing, I don't think. But I think there will, over time, people will start to work out which mitigations really work and have an effect and which don't. And like, I'd love to, the industry to be sharing that information, and certainly Inside Housing will share that. If you've done something really good and it's really worked, tell us about it and we'll tell everyone else about it, basically.
Yeah, no, that's good, Pete. Great points. What struck me actually as you were saying that is that New York City has probably started out on this a year or two ahead of where we're at, and looking at some of the things that they're starting to put in place, like public charging points, and various measures is probably something that's worth taking a look at. Would you add anything to that, Nick?
Yeah, I think, we probably do need to look at the other cities, international, what they've done. How have they got the same problem as us? From that point of view. I mean, I last year when I was in Dubai, I couldn't believe how many there were, how many like Deliveroo Ubers there were, and trying to get some figures out of their fire and rescue services has been proven to be difficult. From that point of view, because internationally, I think we're on par with not New York, so they've got the similar kind of problems, but of course they've got different laws. That's the trouble. Sometimes it's the same problem but different ways of solving it as such. But I think Pete's point about the ban is just not the way forward. It's just not going to work, from that point of view. We've got to be more practical, sharing good practice, collaborating together. I'm sure if you collaborate, or if you've got a large enough stock, going to a reputable dealer might be able to get a really hugely discount on servicing and maintenance kind of thing for your residents, etc. As Pete said, small amount of money to pay, but if you then lose a flat or a life, even more importantly, that's an even bigger price to pay. So, for me, it's like looking beyond it. Technology will come to help us with this. You spoke about, the rising heat on the battery. My issue with that at the moment is the way it works as a chemical reaction, because that's the difference with this kind of fire, is that when the heat reaches a certain thing, it's not going to stop. Once it reaches that point, it's just going to carry on and get that bit. So, unless you leaked it to a detector, it might give that little bit more of early warning. But what we need, and I'm sure technology will come, some kind of bit when it reaches that, something internally inside happens that stops it jumping over that bit. So, for me, so we've got technology doing this. Someone clever will invent something, that at first when they came, we didn't even know how to put out the fire. We had issues where we thought we put it out, put them on a low loader, they took the car away, and then it reignited down the road and caught the tow truck of that, because we realized that actually you're not putting the fire out, you have to submerge them or cover them and that kind of stuff. So we're getting better at our firefighting techniques. We'll get better equipment, kind of thing. But yeah, technology will help us. We want a nice, clever university student as part of their dissertation designing a way of doing it, don't we? Because as I said, technology will help us solve this as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. And it's me just doing a very quick chat GPT question to confirm what I thought. Incidents and fatalities have actually dropped in New York City with some of the measures they put in place. Like you say, there's lots of differences in terms of what they can do and what we can do, but I think that's something that perhaps we should think about for a future session. That's really helpful. For patients, you have been very patient. You have hand up. Please come in with your question.
Yeah, I'm a housing officer with a housing association, and recently we've been having problem about line bikes being parked in the communal areas, And of course, when I go for inspection, I don't know who owns that, to be able to, talk to them about it. Although I put some signs there, but they ignore the signs, So, and those bikes are so heavy. I tried to take one out of the building one day, it was so heavy, I couldn't lift it. So I contacted Live Bike. I said, listen, your bikes are here, come and collect them. They never came. So that's one of the problems I'm having in some of my blocks. Now, the other aspect is residents that actually have the e-bikes themselves. It's quite difficult to identify who has and who hasn't. Now, I think there should be a collaboration, which we have started between our contractors, property safety department, and the neighborhood officers. When we go on inspection and we discover things, we report it to the property safety department. And also contractors, when they go in to do repairs and see e-bikes, they should report it as well. So by doing that, we are able to identify who has and who hasn't got e-bikes in our blocks and be able to manage it. So it is a very growing problem, not only in terms of the fire that it creates, also it breeds ground for antisocial behavior. In the sense that when they congregate in the corridors to charge their e-bikes, they are smoking cannabis, they are abusing tenants that have challenged them, things like that. So it's not only one aspect of e-bike, but other aspect of antisocial behavior, comes up from that. So that's the point I wanted to make. How do we deal with, especially when you see live bags that, we don't know who left them there and how to get rid of them.
Yeah, no, that's good questions. That's really important points you've raised there. It'd be really interesting to hear from any of the housing colleagues on the call with ways they've addressed that. I think you're right though. A collaboration around where everybody, from tenants, all staff, contractors, everybody is aware of it, and we've got better procedures in place on how to deal with it, can only help. And I think I've mentioned several times having an anonymous reporting line for residents. Obviously, they're not going to feel that they can confront anyone, but if they can tell you that, look, there is a what looks to me like a high risk device in our building, and can you come and investigate, then that can only help, can't it? That's great points, Ed. Nick, Pete, don't know if you'd add anything to that.
I was just going to add around, I mean, it's not something we've considered around, the kind of like providers like Lime Bike, Swift and all that they've not really come across our radar as an issue. But if people are, getting issues with them, please drop me a line, because we can probably lean in with our LFB head on and write to these people saying that this has been identified as a problem. You should have a duty to go and collect your bike if they're inside an actual property, because that's not where they're meant to be. But I said it's not been raised before around that type of bike, and I hadn't really considered it. But we can do, we can, with the mayor as well, we can put some kind of pressure on if it's becoming a really large scale problem. Obviously, if it's one or two bikes, I don't think they'll take much notice, but please let me know if that is a continual issue around that types of bikes.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. Jan, are you able just to come in with your point earlier about insurance, whether landlords are expecting or making clear to residents about the need for insurance? Do you want to just, because people may be able to respond in the chat if they didn't notice your comment.
Okay, thank you. My laptop's playing up, so if I disappear or if I wobbly, then it's my machine. It's not me. I haven't been on the vodka early this morning, unusually for me. So the point I was making really was about insurance. Pete mentioned the fact that insurance companies are aware of the high cost of e-bike fires. And it just struck me, and it has struck me for some time now, that a logical way for housing managers to deal with these issues is around the money issue. I'm obviously aware that many social housing tenants don't have their own home insurance. But to say to somebody who has an e-bike, look, we're not banning the e-bike, but you need to be aware that if something goes wrong, we will charge you for any damage that is caused by a fire that is caused by your failed machine. And I just think that is a way of concentrating people's minds a bit, and maybe something that can be pursued rather than some kind of nefarious tenancy nonsense around trying to ban the bikes, which, quite frankly, from my experience, and I've only been in housing 57 years, is bonkers. It would never work. So the insurance issue, I think, is important. And there's also the issue around leaseholders. Leaseholders who sublet their properties will also have, or should be, taking account of the insurance issue for the people they've sublet their properties to. And I just think these things are worth my last bit was about leaseholders, was whether, just to remind leaseholders of their own responsibilities around insurance, particularly if they've sublet their properties.
No, great points, Jan. Thank you for that. So we're running pretty close to time now. We've got tons of really helpful contributions in the chat, and what we'll do is we'll take that away and try and respond to that and circulate that to everybody at the end. And so I think it's important we do finish as close to time as we can. So I want to thank you both, Nick and Pete, for your contributions today. Really appreciate it, and everybody else that's contributed. What I'm taking from today is that this risk around e-mobility, it's no longer something that we can treat as marginal, but the challenge is we can't realistically eliminate every risk, and it's not going to be practical to impose blanket bans, but we can start to take, if we haven't already, we can continue to take reasonable, proportionate steps around educating residents and staff, locating where devices are being stored and charged, assessing which situations carry the greatest risk, and looking to mitigate that. So for some organisations, that'll mean communications. Others, it will mean starting device checks, monitoring, looking at charging locations. But the important thing is that doing nothing or not knowing where those risks are is becoming harder to defend. So I don't know, Nick, have you got a takeaway? If there's one thing that you'd like people to take away from this, what would you suggest?
For me, it's about education and collaboration. That's the way we're going to solve it at the moment. As I said, like I said, banning is not a real solution. Apart from in certain places, someone put something in the car around buildings with cladding and simultaneous evacuation. Yeah, that's a completely different risk, from that point of view. And hopefully you've got more of a kind of managerial oversight of that type of building where you can keep e-bikes out of common parts from them. But yeah, education, is really the key, in collaboration with your residents, from that point of view.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Nick. Pete, would you have a takeaway message?
I think it might just be, look, the thing is, I think it goes back to something Nick said, actually, which is, I think a useful mental exercise would be, imagine one day you are standing in front of a coroner, or you're getting a press request from some annoying journalist like me. There has been an incident in one of your blocks of flats, and the question isn't, why didn't you prevent this? Because no one can prevent everything, but it's tell us what you did. What steps did you take to reduce this risk? And what answer are you going to give to that? And does it sound reasonable? If you put it in that context, does it sound like, do someone listen to that answer and go, do you know what, fair enough, you did everything you could reasonably? Or do they listen to that and go, why was nothing put in place? And I think that if that like little mental exercise worries you and makes you think, God, I wouldn't have much to say, then maybe there's more to be done. So I think that's the point I'd land on, I think.
I completely agree. That's a very good summary, I think. So again, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Pete. Thank you for everybody that's joined and contributed. Really appreciate it. We'll keep the chat open. We'll pull all that off and try and give some considered responses to them all between us, and circulate. But thanks again, everyone, and have a fantastic day.